Mindfulness meditation is a specific practice on learning to become more present in our day-to-day and moment-to-moment life. In many ways we could say that mindfulness meditation is a way of life, but it could be reflected in two specific practices, a formal one and an informal practice. The formal practice is using specific mindfulness meditation objects to help us develop more awareness of what's actually going on in the mind and body. We may become aware of the breath as an object of awareness, or bodily sensations, listening to sounds, and mindfulness is the practice of learning to become more awake, more present to our day-to-day, moment-to-moment life. Mindfulness is a bit different than other meditative traditions in that we don't use mantras or visualizations, but we focus our attention into the present moment. Sometimes we may focus with the breath, other times bodily sensations, perhaps at times thoughts, emotions, observing, if you will, the changing nature of our mind states and our body states. So we don't use mantras to any degree or visualizations. It's about really feeling into this own body-mind. Mindfulness-based stress reduction was developed at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center by Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn and assisted by Dr. Saki Santorelli. And this program was developed in 1979 by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Jon Kabat-Zinn actually had a promising career in molecular biology, working at a medical school at UMass Medical Center. He also was a mindfulness meditation practitioner, and I believe that he, in his early career, was reflecting on how he could potentially bring both of these worlds together, medicine and meditation. Each he had a real passion for. And during a meditation retreat, he evidently had a moment's pause where this vision of developing mindfulness as a stress reduction program arose into his mind, and he became evidently very excited about possibly implementing a program using mindfulness as a way of working with stress, pain, and illness. This had actually never been done before. He went back to UMass Medical Center and contacted his colleagues and proposed a pilot project of starting mindfulness-based stress reduction programs at UMass Medical Center in Worcester. And at the time, his colleagues were very thrilled and gave him support, and Dr. Kabat-Zinn actually requested physicians to please send to him their most difficult patients, chronic pain patients, anxiety patients, and begin a mindfulness-based stress reduction program. John, also coming from a scientific family and a science background, also has the unique capabilities of also studying and analyzing the data that he compiled while working in the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, and began to study various populations, including people that lived with chronic pain that went through his program, people that had anxiety and panic disorders, and many other conditions, and began to accumulate data and begin to publish articles that were published in major medical journals. So through the years, there's been a growing research in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and particularly in how it works with people living with stress, pain, and illness. And there's actually now over 200 medical centers in the United States that actually have mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, as well as it's grown internationally. Generally, in each class in mindfulness-based stress reduction, we begin with a guided meditation, and then we often introduce a form of mindful movement. And we generally introduce, over the 8-week period, 3 forms of mindful movement. We introduce mindful yoga, or mindful walking, or mindful qigong. So after we do a period of movement, then we also break into small groups during the class and begin to discuss with one another about what we're learning about ourselves as we've been practicing with the mindfulness CDs that are handed out at the beginning of the class, that we'd like each participant to work with at home, developing mindfulness into their day-to-day life. And then we take a break, of course, and then we'll come back to a larger group and begin to discuss with one another about what we're learning and discovering about ourselves as we bring more of the lens of awareness, of mindfulness, to ourselves in our day-to-day life. They generally will last 8 weeks, and we meet together once a week for 2.5 hours. And then often in the 6th week, we also will have an all-day session that is part of the 8-week program that's generally held on a Saturday or Sunday from 9:30 to 4:30, where actually we make it a day of silence where we go very deep into the practices of mindfulness. Of course, the instructor will be giving some guided meditation, so there will be some talking with the instructor, but the participants will all be keeping silent so that we can go much more deeply into the practice. And the day is composed of alternating between periods of stillness, doing sitting meditation, and movement, whether it be walking, yoga, or qigong. There's a number of different stories, and one that's coming to mind right now, and this is something that's very practical. There was a woman that was dealing with a lot of chronic pain issues in her lower back, and she also worked as a receptionist in an office. And one day, while she was working, she happened to turn to go to this cabinet that she goes to like a number of times a day, so consequently a number of times a week, and hundreds and thousands of times over the months and years. But as she was turning, all of a sudden she became aware that the way that she was turning was actually exacerbating her pain in her back that she never actually noticed before. Because in mindfulness training, we're really beginning to take a look not only in working with the formal practices of mindfulness with the CDs, but bringing our mindful awareness into our day-to-day life. When we're eating, know that we're eating. When we're moving, know that we're moving. So forth. All these different activities of daily life we bring more attention to. And so she brought more attention to the way that she was moving and noticed that her pain was exacerbating because of that move. And so she, upon realizing that, it was like a big light bulb went on, like, gosh, if I just have this cabinet change a certain position or change how I actually go and reach it, I'm going to be having a lot less pain. And thus began, due to this attentiveness, she was able to begin to decrease and not further exacerbate her chronic pain condition. There's been a number of people working with panic and anxiety that have had significant breakthroughs. One gentleman in particular was very burdened by a lot of anxious thoughts, and one of the components of the sitting meditation practice is to be able to begin to sit back and observe thoughts and begin to see that thoughts come and that they go, that they're ever transient. And this gentleman, I remember his discovery of observing that his thoughts were transitory, that even the anxious thoughts that he was feeling was just something that comes into awareness and leaves. And this recognition helped him to be able to begin to disengage from anxious thoughts, to be able just to observe them as just thought patterns that just come and go. And he began to actually experience more and more freedom and less anxiety when he realized that his thoughts, that his anxious thoughts were just thoughts, and that they come and that they go. I've had a number of people say that because they've developed more body awareness, they're becoming more aware of how they're holding themselves in their body, getting tighter, or being aware of just the mind states that are connected with the body, that when there's uncomfortable mind states, angry states, sad states, there's a lot of, feeling a lot of stress, that the body seems to get tighter. And then many people have begun to discover that there's a relationship between those internal reactions to an elevation of blood pressure. And upon realizing that they are holding tightly, they can become proactive in beginning to soften their bodies and their minds, and thus lowering their blood pressure. And many people discover that they can begin to manage their blood pressure more because they're more aware, if you will. They have their fingers on the pulse of how they're feeling in their own mind and bodies in their day-to-day life. They can notice when they're beginning to get tight and release that much sooner, thus trying to keep the blood pressure at an equalized level. Now, one thing I'd like to also recommend is that in mindfulness, we're looking in some sense to cultivate deeper levels of healing. John Kabat-Zinn has a wonderful definition of healing, which is to come into terms with the way things are. There could be people, for example, that do have blood pressure, and even though they're developing some mind-body tools to help to soften and relax, to keep a closer monitoring faculty of awareness on their own body and mind, but no matter what they do, their blood pressure still is elevated. So, fortunately in medicine we have blood pressure pills, and so of course these need to be taken. But the deeper level of healing with mindfulness is that perhaps the healing is the coming to terms that you do have blood pressure, and how do I work with my emotional responses to it? And if my emotional responses have a lot of suffering, have a lot of anger, a lot of sadness and fear, mindfulness has this very wonderful way of being able to begin to address these issues. Doctors sometimes say, you know, you got to learn to live with it. But like, how do you learn to live with something that you don't like and you don't want and you wish you didn't have? And so mindfulness would be also working with a person on the emotional reactivity that often comes with living with pain or illness. And so the first thing that comes up is someone becomes aware that they are angry, they are scared, they are sad. Those are usually the first three: fear, sadness, anger, also confusion. And mindfulness would be able to help us to be able to acknowledge those types of feelings. What we discover is as we begin to acknowledge our anger, our fear, our sadness, our confusion, that actually our relationship to our pain, to our illness begins to change. We're no longer meeting it with resistance. This is one of the most important points in mindfulness-based stress reduction, is that when we have resistance to how things are, it only causes more pain, more fear, more suffering. When we learn how to go with what's happening, begin to acknowledge the feelings that we're feeling, gradually in time we may be able to open and come into accepting things as they are. And I use the word acceptance different from the word acknowledgement. Mindfulness doesn't mean that you have to accept or be okay with what's here, because it may be that you're not. I have blood pressure, I hate it, I don't like it, I have cancer, I don't want it, I don't want it to be here. So we're not saying in mindfulness that you have to accept it, but what we want to do is first begin with where it is that we are. Let me acknowledge my anger about my cancer, my headaches, my chronic pain, my blood pressure. Let me acknowledge my sadness, my anger, my fear. And as we acknowledge these feelings, letting, in some ways, honoring the resistance and working with it and acknowledging it, gradually we come into a place of more deeper healing, potentially into a place of acceptance where we come to, in some sense, to make peace with ourselves, with what it is that we have. For people interested in the mindfulness CDs, you can contact my website, www.mindfulnessprograms.com. And there's a lot of information on upcoming mindfulness programs that I have to offer, as well as a button that you can click to access the Mindful Healing CDs that you can buy directly on my website, or you can go to Amazon.com. I got involved in meditation when I was in an undergraduate school, where I was living out in northeastern Vermont. But prior to that, I became very interested in spirituality, if you will. From a very early age, I had actually experienced a lot of death in my life. And by the time I was 10, I had lost my brother, my best friend, and my grandfather. And so I knew from a very early age that the awareness of death. And as a matter of fact, I remember when I first became aware of dying, which was when I was actually 4 years old. And I was riding in the back seat of my parents' car. And I'm not sure how I got this realization, but I just all of a sudden became aware that I was going to die someday, and that it could happen at any moment. And I expressed my concern to my mom and my dad about this, and they very lovingly said to me, "Oh, don't worry, Bob. It's not going to happen for a long, long time." And I knew even at 4 that they were just trying to be nice to me. They loved me. They didn't want to scare me. But I also knew that they weren't telling me the truth, because that awareness was that, yes, indeed, it could happen at any time. And as I said, just a few moments ago, by the time I was 10, I had lost 3 significant people in my life. Also growing up during the Vietnam War, and it was a very wild time. My school went on strike. They closed. Teachers left, never came back. The Beatles were growing their hair long. I mean, this was a wild time. And I lived just right outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Actually, my cousin used to go over to Timothy Leary's house. I used to wonder what he was doing over there, until later I began to find out more. I was a very confused young kid, trying to understand what was the meaning of life. And I believe that it was these experiences that led me to want to understand more about what is this life, what is life really about. And I think this edge of living with knowing that I'm going to die at any moment really helped to catapult me into a sense of some urgency. I was always drawn, even from an early age, when I look back at it now, to the East. My first introduction to the East was Chinese restaurants outside of Boston as a young child. And it's very funny, but when I look back on it, like when I went into Chinese restaurants, it was a very different feeling than Howard Johnson's. And the smells were different, the visual images in the restaurant were different, and even the countenance of the waiters and the waitresses. There was a certain type of quality that I would almost say now, like they had a more serenity, more sereneness to their actions, to how they were, than any other restaurants or places I ever went to. And the food was wonderful. And there was something about the East that just really fascinated me. And I saw big images of Buddhas and different pictures, and there was something there. When I discovered the philosophical teachings of the East that first began with Lao Tzu from Taoism, that spoke about that if you want to know yourself, if you want to know the universe, look inside yourself, not outside of yourself. And I had actually, in my entire life, never heard of that type of concept before, looking inside yourself. And it resonated something so deeply, it made so much sense to me that if I wanted to know the truth of life, I needed to look inside, not outside. Perhaps for many people, like, oh, that's a no-brainer, but in my life, I had never been exposed to that type of thought or idea. Lao Tzu says, there's no need to go and look outside your window, for everything you need to know is inside you. And when I first read those lines from the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, it was like, I just couldn't believe it. Like I felt inside me, this is leading me to something that I need to look into more, an important place. And I began, this is when I was in an undergraduate school in northern Vermont, to pick up different books of the East. I actually took a course called Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Zen, and I was like a fish finally going into water that hadn't been in water for a long time. And the East in philosophies, I studied Hinduism and Buddhism, as I was mentioning, really began to draw me much more deeply into this way of life, I would say. And so I began getting involved into Eastern philosophy in my undergraduate years at school, and when I eventually moved out to San Francisco, I met a Vipassana mindfulness meditation teacher, Dr. Rina Sarkar, whose teacher was a Buddhist monk. His name was Tongpulu Sayadaw. And after I graduated graduate school, I had become now a student of Vipassana meditation, and she invited me, along with some other students, to go visit her teacher in Southeast Asia, in Burma. And I was, in 1980, I flew to Burma with Rina and some other friends, and there we ordained as monks and nuns in a Buddhist monastery, in a forest monastery in central Burma. And I've been involved in Buddhist meditation ever since. And I eventually came back to the United States, and I just wrote, but then we started actually a monastery in Boulder Creek, California, and I lived in that monastery for 8 years, serving the monks and also doing a lot of intensive practice. So that's a little bit about my background of how I got into Buddhism. And then after I left the monastery, I entered the advanced training, if you will, and that's a long story that I'll save for another time, but I ended up meeting a wonderful woman that I fell in love with, and we got married, and I have two children, 2 boys now, but I needed to find some work, and an ex-monk friend of mine sent me John Kabat-Zinn's book, Full Catastrophe Living. I was actually working at a stroke center, which I was very fortunate to get a job working with people living with strokes and Parkinson's, MS, other orthopedic and neurological, and other neurological conditions. And I was beginning to teach them a little bit of some mindfulness meditation practice and saw that it was very helpful. And when I read John Kabat-Zinn's book sent by my ex-monk friend, I couldn't believe that someone had actually created a whole program using mindfulness meditation to work with people living with stress, pain, and illness. And I became very excited and said, this is what I got to do. And I wrote John Kabat-Zinn a letter, and I thanked him for this book. And this was actually before he was famous. This was in 1990 or 91. But he called me back and thanked me for my letter and invited me to come to UMass Medical Center and see their program. And my parents live right outside of Boston, and so I was actually planning a trip there in the next couple of months. And so when I went back, I met with John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli and saw their program, and I just knew like this was the work I had been, this is going to sound kind of funny to say, born to do, or my life's work that was bringing together meditation, as well as working with people with illness. One of the things that I didn't mention was that while I was living in the monastery, I was also very influenced by Stephen Levine, Ram Dass, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and their work with the dying, and that fed sort of part of my own inner work of mindfulness of death that I had been also working with, struggling with since the age of 4, and also have spent as part of Buddhist meditation, we spend a lot of time also on mindfulness of death practices, going to cemeteries and so forth. And so I actually began working with hospice as well towards the end of my years at the monastery. But when I found out about Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, it was sort of bringing together, working with people with illness, with stress, terminal illness, and using meditation that seemed to be just an amazing, wonderful fit for me, and I've been extraordinarily blessed. Perhaps in closing, we could just maybe sit for a couple of minutes and invite all of you viewers to get a little taste of mindfulness. So let's just take a moment to bring our awareness into our body and minds. Perhaps this is the first time today that we're stopping after a lot of doing and going from here to there. So taking some moments just to become present, feeling into our own bodies and minds. And just acknowledging how we're feeling. And then just gently shifting awareness to mindful breathing, focusing either in the abdomen or the tip of the nose. Find a place that works for you. If the awareness is in the abdomen, feeling how the belly is expanding on the inhalation and contracting on the exhalation, or perhaps at the tip of the nose, feeling the contact or touch of the ear and the inner nostril, the tip of the nose, the upper lip, and just becoming mindful and aware of the breath, breathing normally, breathing naturally. Just becoming aware of the breath, breathing normal and natural, knowing that when you're breathing in, that you're breathing in. Knowing, breathing out as we're breathing out. Being present to the breath. As we're sitting, breathing in and breathing out, there may be different sounds or bodily sensations, thoughts and emotions. Just noticing this body alive. Different senses coming into awareness, sounds, sensations, noticing how they come and go. Noticing perhaps the wanderings of thoughts, emotions, acknowledging these different mind states and body states, and coming back to the breath in and the breath out. This being just a very short meditation, let's just take a moment as we conclude in congratulating ourselves that we took this time to become present. May we know this is an act of love. May we be at peace, and may all beings, may they all be at peace. Thank you.